Welcome to Mysterystories, where quiet houses hold restless memories. Tonight we enter Ravenwood House, an estate shaped by silence, patience, and hidden truth. Listen closely, as calm observation guides us through corridors where nothing shouts, yet everything waits for the moment it must be seen in. Measured time ahead. Quietly. Chapter 1. The House That Never Rests. Ravenwood House stood at the edge of the moor as it had for more than a century, neither welcoming nor forbidding, simply present. It was the kind of building that did not announce itself from a distance. One noticed it only when already too close, when the road narrowed and the trees thinned, and the air seemed to change its weight. Locals passed it without looking, as though attention itself might be an invitation. The house was built of dark stone, weathered into uneven shades by decades of rain and wind. Ivy climbed its western wall with determined patience, framing windows that reflected little of the sky. The roof sloped heavily, as if burdened by the years it had carried. Nothing about Ravenwood suggested decay, yet nothing about it suggested comfort either. It endured. That was the impression it gave. Endurance without warmth. On the afternoon the story truly began, the sky hung low and pale, and the moor stretched outward in muted browns and greys. A carriage turned off the main road and rolled toward the house, its wheels crunching softly over gravel that had not been disturbed in some time. Inside sat three people, each lost in their own thoughts, each pretending that this visit was merely practical. The first was Eleanor Whitcomb, a woman of composed manner and careful speech. She had inherited Ravenwood House after the passing of a distant relative she barely remembered. The inheritance had been unexpected, inconvenient, and impossible to refuse. She told herself she was here only to settle matters, to see the place properly, to decide what should be done. Yet as the house came into view, she felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with responsibility. Beside her sat Thomas Hale, a solicitor tasked with overseeing the transfer of ownership. He was a man who trusted documents more than impressions, but even he found himself watching the windows as though expecting movement. He adjusted his gloves twice without realizing it. Across from them sat Margaret Finch, Eleanor's longtime companion, invited for support rather than necessity. Margaret observed everything quietly, her gaze lingering on details others overlooked. The carriage stopped before the front steps. No one emerged to greet them. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped down, her boots meeting stone worn smooth by countless arrivals and departures. The front door stood closed, but unlocked. That detail unsettled her more than a locked door might have. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with dust and old wood. The entrance hall was spacious but dim, its high ceiling swallowing sound. Their footsteps echoed softly, then seemed to fade too quickly, as if the house absorbed noise rather than returned it. Furniture stood neatly arranged, preserved rather than lived in. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects painted with solemn restraint. Eyes followed movement subtly, or perhaps it only seemed so. Thomas cleared his throat and began listing practical matters, but his voice sounded smaller than usual in the vast space. As they moved deeper into the house, Eleanor noticed small things that did not quite align. A clock ticking in one room, but silent in another. A door that resisted opening, then yielded suddenly without explanation. Windows that admitted light unevenly, leaving corners in shadow even at midday. Margaret paused near the foot of the main staircase. She rested her hand on the banister and frowned slightly. The wood was warm beneath her fingers, warmer than expected in such a cool house. She said nothing, but the sensation lingered with her as they continued. Their tour progressed without incident, yet unease grew quietly, like a draught slipping through unseen cracks. Ravenwood House did not confront its visitors. It waited. It allowed them to settle into the assumption that nothing was wrong. It was only when Eleanor reached the room designated as the study that the first true disturbance occurred. The door stood ajar. She was certain it had been closed moments before. Inside, papers lay scattered across the desk, though no one had touched them. A single chair stood pulled back, angled as if someone had risen hastily. Thomas suggested the papers had shifted in transit, though there had been no recent movement. Margaret said nothing, but her eyes traced the floor, the walls, the space behind the door. She felt, with quiet certainty, that they were not alone in their attention. The house remained silent. That silence, heavy and deliberate, was what followed them as the daylight faded and the first night at Ravenwood House began. Night settled over Ravenwood House without ceremony. The lamps were lit, their glow failing to soften the corners of the rooms. Shadows gathered where light could not quite reach, and the house seemed larger in darkness, its corridors stretching beyond what memory allowed. Eleanor sat in her assigned bedroom, reviewing papers she could no longer concentrate on. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the occasional creak that might have been settling wood, or might have been something else entirely. She told herself that old houses made noise. They always had. Still, she found herself listening carefully, counting the seconds between sounds. Down the corridor, Thomas prepared for bed with the mechanical efficiency of routine. He placed his watch on the bedside table, aligned his papers neatly, and extinguished the lamp. Sleep did not come easily. His thoughts returned to the study, to the chair pulled back from the desk. He had seen many houses in his profession, many estates abandoned or half forgotten. None had unsettled him in this way. Margaret, meanwhile, remained awake by choice. She sat near her window, looking out onto the darkened grounds. The moon revealed little of the landscape, only vague outlines and shifting shadows. At some point, she became aware of a light flickering briefly in a window on the opposite wing. She blinked, certain it was a reflection, but when she looked again, the window was dark. The first sound came shortly after midnight. It was not loud. It was precise, a single footstep above Eleanor's room. She froze, breath held, listening. Another step followed. Then a pause. The sound was measured, deliberate, as though someone were walking with care. Eleanor rose and opened her door slowly. The corridor lay empty, lit only by a distant lamp. The footsteps did not resume. Elsewhere in the house, Margaret heard the same sound from a different angle. To her, it seemed to come from the staircase, descending, then stopping abruptly. She stood, heart steady but alert. She did not call out. Experience had taught her that not every mystery wished to be challenged immediately. By morning, all was still. No sign of intrusion appeared. Doors were locked as they had been left. No windows stood open. Thomas dismissed the events as imagination encouraged by unfamiliar surroundings. Eleanor wanted to agree, but she could not ignore the certainty that something had moved through the house with intention. Over breakfast, conversation remained polite, cautious. No one mentioned the footsteps. Instead, they spoke of weather, of schedules, of practical arrangements, yet glances lingered longer than necessary. Silence filled the spaces between words. Later that day, while examining an upper corridor, Eleanor noticed a door she had not seen before. It blended into the paneling, its handle worn smooth. When she tried it, the door opened onto a narrow room, containing nothing but dust and a single chair facing the wall. The chair was warm. Eleanor stepped back quickly, pulse quickening. She did not know why that detail frightened her more than anything else. She closed the door and leaned against the wall, steadying herself. Ravenwood House, she realized, was not merely old. It was aware of those within it. That night, as the lamps were extinguished once more, the house settled into its watchful quiet. And somewhere within its walls, something waited. patient and unhurried, for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Chapter 2. Polite Guests, A.N.D. Private Fears. Morning in Ravenwood House arrived without sunlight. The sky beyond the curtains was the color of watered milk, and the wind moved across the moor with a steady, patient insistence. The house seemed to have anticipated the weather. It felt built for grey days, as if brightness would have been out of place within its stone and shadow. Eleanor Whitcomb descended to the breakfast room with the careful composure of someone who refused to be hurried by discomfort. She had slept badly, yet she would not allow the night to show itself on her face. The idea of being influenced by an old building seemed unreasonable, and Eleanor had always trusted what was reasonable. She told herself that the footsteps, the warm chair, and the subtle feeling of being observed were simply the mind adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings. The breakfast room held its own quiet atmosphere, different from the entrance hall. Softer, but no less heavy. A long table sat beneath a chandelier that seemed too ornate for such restrained surroundings. The place settings had been prepared with a precision that suggested habit, although no servants had yet appeared in view. Silverware lay aligned. Cups waited empty. The fire in the grate was lit, but it gave more scent than warmth. Thomas Hale entered a moment later, his expression calm, his suit neat as though he had dressed for an appointment in town. He greeted Eleanor politely, his voice steady, yet his eyes flicked toward the corners of the room as if measuring distance. He sat with a deliberate care, placing his briefcase beside his chair, and offered a small comment about the draft in the corridors. It was an ordinary remark meant to make the morning feel ordinary. Margaret Finch arrived last, and when she entered the room she paused briefly, as if listening to something the others could not hear. She smiled after a moment, a soft gesture that belonged more to manners than to emotion, then took her seat. Margaret was the kind of person who did not fill silence in a hurry. She seemed comfortable with pauses, with observation, with letting things reveal themselves without force. Breakfast itself came in stages. At first, Eleanor assumed that perhaps supplies had been left for them. But then a woman appeared in the doorway carrying a tray, moving with the quiet assurance of someone who had served in the same house for many years. She introduced herself as Mrs. Nettleby, caretaker and housekeeper, her voice firm and respectful. Her hair was pinned neatly, and her face held a guarded expression that suggested both duty and discretion. She spoke of practical matters, the stove, the locks, the cellar that needed attention, the roof that held up well despite the wind. She made no mention of the study door being ajar or the footsteps overhead, and her calmness seemed almost rehearsed. When Eleanor asked how long she had been at Ravenwood House, Mrs. Nettleby answered without hesitation. Nearly 20 years. She said it as if it should have explained everything. Thomas asked about other staff. Mrs. Nettleby replied that the family had not required much help in recent years. One gardener came in the warmer months. A man in the village delivered coal. Repairs were handled as needed. The house did not see company often, she added, with a polite emphasis that sounded like warning wrapped in courtesy. The mention of company was not incidental. Before Eleanor could respond, a knock sounded from the entrance hall. Slow and firm, Mrs. Nettleby's face remained neutral, yet something tightened in the set of her mouth. She excused herself and left the breakfast room. A few minutes later, she returned with a visitor. He was a tall man, perhaps in his early 40s, wearing a dark coat damp with mist. His hair was carefully combed, his posture straight. He introduced himself as Victor Langford, a local historian and representative of the village council. Though the way he held himself suggested he was more accustomed to giving instructions than receiving them. He apologized for calling without notice, then explained that word had reached the village that Ravenwood House had changed hands. He spoke politely, but beneath his words there was a clear desire to measure Eleanor, to assess what her presence might mean. Eleanor invited him to sit. Thomas remained standing for a moment, as if unsure whether to treat this as a social visit or a legal complication. Margaret watched Victor with calm attention, noting his hands, which were clean, yet marked with faint ink stains near the fingertips, and his eyes, which moved too often toward the hallway. Victor spoke of Ravenwood House's history. He described it as a landmark, a place woven into local memory. He mentioned old families and lost fortunes, fires that had nearly occurred but never did, weddings that had been celebrated and then spoken of with regret. His words were smooth. They created an image of the house as a cultural relic rather than a private property. Yet Eleanor sensed that his interest went beyond admiration. When Eleanor asked whether her late relative had been well regarded, Victor's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. He offered a polite response about privacy and eccentricity. The previous owner, he said, preferred solitude. That was all. But his tone implied more. Margaret spoke for the first time. Her voice was gentle but clear. She asked whether the house had been visited recently by anyone from the village. Victor hesitated half a second before answering. Not that he knew of. He said it with a mild firmness, as if closing a door. Thomas changed the subject to legal matters, explaining that the estate was under Eleanor's authority now and would be handled accordingly. Victor nodded, but his eyes tightened. He then asked whether Eleanor intended to remain at Ravenwood House or sell it. The question was casual in form, but Eleanor felt the weight beneath it. She answered honestly that she had not decided. Victor smiled, a polite curve that did not reach his eyes. He rose, offered a courteous farewell, and left. When the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. Eleanor realized she had been holding tension in her shoulders, and she had not noticed until it loosened. After Victor's departure, the day continued with quiet exploration. Eleanor reviewed documents in the study, determined to understand the estate's affairs. Thomas inspected locks and deeds, walking through corridors with practical focus. Margaret moved slowly through rooms, noticing what others dismissed. She paused near the staircase again, touching the banister lightly, then withdrew her hand as if the wood had spoken in temperature. In the afternoon, another visitor arrived. This one came not from the village council but from the estate's past. A man named Henry Sallow, lean and pale, introduced himself as a former groundskeeper. He had worked at Ravenwood House years earlier, before Mrs. Nettleby's time. And now, he appeared with a careful humility that seemed genuine. He asked to speak with Eleanor privately. His eyes kept drifting toward the corridors behind her, as if expecting someone to overhear. Eleanor agreed, and they sat in the small drawing room where the curtains filtered the light into a dull amber. Henry spoke in low tones. He said he had heard Eleanor had inherited the house, and he felt it was important to offer a warning. When Eleanor asked what he meant, Henry swallowed, then said that Ravenwood House carried trouble. Not superstition, he insisted, but something quieter and worse. Secrets, the kind that sat in walls and waited. Eleanor asked what secrets. Henry hesitated, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might leave, without explaining. Then he spoke of a locked room, an upper chamber that had once belonged to the family's eldest son. He said the son had vanished many years ago, not with the drama of a public disappearance, but with the soft erasure of someone quietly removed from conversation. The village had accepted it with uneasy relief. Thomas dismissed Henry's story as gossip. Margaret did not dismiss it. She asked Henry whether he had ever seen the locked room opened. Henry shook his head, then added something that made Eleanor's pulse tighten. He said the door was not always locked. Sometimes, he said, the lock turned on its own. When Henry left, the house seemed colder, despite the steady fire. Eleanor walked alone through a corridor upstairs and found herself standing before the door she had discovered the day before. The concealed one in the paneling. She stared at it as though it might move. The memory of the warm chair inside returned to her, with unwanted clarity. The idea that a lock might turn itself felt suddenly less impossible than it should. As evening approached, the sky darkened early, and Ravenwood House gathered night around itself like a cloak. The visitors had brought more than information. They had brought pressure. They had brought watchful interest. Eleanor began to understand that the house was not only unsettling because of its age. It unsettled because people still cared about what lay within it. And that meant something remained unresolved. The second night at Ravenwood House began with an almost deliberate calm, as if the house wished to lull them into believing the unease of the first night had been coincidence. Mrs. Nettleby served dinner with quiet efficiency. The meal was simple and nourishing, and the clink of cutlery offered a faint comfort. For a time, Eleanor felt almost foolish for her earlier apprehension. The conversation stayed practical. Thomas spoke of the paperwork that required signatures. Eleanor asked Mrs. Nettleby about the village suppliers. Margaret listened more than she spoke, her gaze shifting occasionally toward the doorway, as if noting how shadows gathered there. After dinner, they moved into the sitting room. The fire burned low. Rain began to tap softly against the windows, steady and thin, like fingers drumming patiently. Eleanor found herself watching the flames, thinking of the people who had once sat in this same room. She tried to imagine her late relative, solitary and silent, living with a housekeeper and little else. It seemed an oddly austere life for such a large estate. Thomas excused himself early, claiming fatigue. He climbed the stairs with a candle in hand, the flame bending in the draught. Eleanor and Margaret remained below. Margaret poured tea, a quiet ritual meant to steady the mind. The warmth of the cup in Eleanor's hands helped, but only slightly. The house settled around them. The ticking of a distant clock became noticeable, then disappeared again when Eleanor strained to locate it. The subtle shifting of boards sounded like a slow breath. Nothing overt happened. Yet Eleanor felt a constant sense that the quiet was not empty. Margaret spoke softly, as though not wishing to disturb the air itself. She asked Eleanor what she thought of Victor Langford. Eleanor said he was polite, too interested, possibly worried about the estate's future. Margaret nodded. She said Victor's questions had been framed as concern, but his attention had been fixed on whether Eleanor intended to stay. It was the kind of interest that suggested fear of discovery rather than fear of decline. Eleanor wanted to laugh, to dismiss the idea as melodrama, but she could not. Instead, she asked Margaret what she thought of Henry Sallow. Margaret's expression remained calm. She said Henry had been frightened, but not in the theatrical way of someone repeating ghost stories for attention. He had spoken like someone remembering something he wished he could forget. She added, after a pause, that fear often clung to real events more than to imagined ones. They fell silent again. The fire crackled. Rain continued. Then the sound came. It did not come from above this time. It came from the corridor beyond the sitting room. Faint but unmistakable. A soft scrape, like a chair being moved across wood. Eleanor's grip tightened on her cup. Margaret set her teacup down slowly without making a sound. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance Eleanor saw that Margaret had heard it clearly too. It was not imagination. It was not the groaning of old beams. It was deliberate movement. Eleanor rose. Margaret rose with her. Neither of them spoke. They moved toward the door and opened it onto the corridor. The hallway was dim. The lamps had been turned low. Shadows filled the space between pools of light. The air carried a faint chill that seemed separate from the weather. Eleanor stepped out first, her footsteps quiet on the runner carpet. Margaret followed, her gaze moving over the walls, the floor, the far end of the hall. Another sound came, farther away. This time it was a gentle click, like a latch being lifted. Eleanor's pulse began to race. She told herself to call Thomas, to wake him, to be sensible. Yet something in her refused to retreat. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the simple desire to stop being afraid of a building. They moved along the corridor. The click came again, nearer. Eleanor reached the turn where the hall branched toward the staircase, and she stopped. At the base of the stairs, a door stood slightly open. Eleanor was certain it had been closed earlier. She remembered the neat alignment, the way Mrs. Nettleby had insisted the house be secured for the night. Yet now the door gaped a few inches, revealing darkness beyond. Margaret did not touch it. She leaned forward slightly, listening. Eleanor did the same. No breathing. No footsteps. Only the faint whisper of rain against distant glass. Eleanor pushed the door open. It led not to a room, but to a narrow passageway that Eleanor had not noticed before. A service corridor, perhaps, built into the thickness of the house. The air that drifted from it smelled of dust, and something older, something like paper, left too long in damp. The passage was unlit, but the glow from the hallway candle caught the edge of a wall, revealing scuffed marks where hands might have touched. Margaret's voice was low. She said they should not go in without light. Eleanor nodded, but before she could step back to fetch a lamp, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. On the floor just inside the passage lay a small object. It glinted faintly in the candlelight. Eleanor crouched and reached for it. It was a key, old-fashioned, with a worn brass head and an iron shaft. It looked as though it had been used many times. It was warm in her palm, as if it had been held moments before. Margaret breathed in quietly, a restrained reaction that carried more meaning than a gasp. Eleanor stood slowly. She held the key between them, and both understood the same thing without saying it. Someone had been here, not long ago, not in the past. Now. They closed the door and returned to the sitting room, not because fear drove them, but because instinct demanded caution. Eleanor placed the key on the table. It looked ordinary there, almost harmless. Yet it felt like a promise of something that could no longer remain hidden. They woke Thomas. He descended with reluctance, his face pale with tiredness, irritation appearing briefly before it was replaced by concern when he saw the key. He asked where it came from. Eleanor explained quietly. Thomas wanted to believe it was mislaid by Mrs. Nettleby. But when they questioned her gently, she looked genuinely startled. She said she had never seen that key before. The denial could have been truth, or it could have been practiced. Afterward, when they returned to their rooms, sleep became almost impossible. Ravenwood House did not shout its intentions. It offered small, precise disturbances, each one pushing them closer to the center of whatever lay hidden within its walls. Eleanor lay in bed listening. The house creaked softly, but beneath that familiar sound she sensed something else. The sense of movement contained and restrained, like a figure pausing behind a door, waiting for the right moment to step forward. When dawn finally came, the grey light felt less like relief and more like a pause granted by something that did not need to hurry. Ravenwood House had given them a key, and with it, a quiet invitation into its private history, whether they wanted it or not. Chapter 3. The First Unthinkable Event. Morning did not restore normality to Ravenwood House. Instead, it revealed how fragile the illusion of calm had become. Light filtered through the windows reluctantly, as though the house resisted being seen too clearly. Eleanor woke with the key still in her thoughts, its weight remembered in her palm even after it had been placed safely away. She dressed slowly, listening to the sounds of the house as if they might offer explanation. They did not. Downstairs, the breakfast room felt subtly altered. Nothing was out of place. Yet Eleanor sensed that the room had been disturbed, not physically but in atmosphere. Mrs. Nettleby moved more quietly than usual, her expression composed yet guarded. Thomas arrived last, his face lined with the strain of poor sleep. Margaret appeared as she always did, observant and calm, as though restlessness was something to be examined rather than endured. Conversation remained restrained. The key was not mentioned. No one spoke of the hidden passage or the warm metal that suggested recent use. Instead, Eleanor proposed that they continue their inspection of the house in daylight, beginning with the upper floors. Thomas agreed readily. Mrs. Nettleby hesitated before nodding. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. The upper corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with doors that seemed deliberately similar, each one denying distinction. Eleanor walked ahead, her hand brushing the wall occasionally as if grounding herself in the solidity of stone. She told herself that daylight would dispel the uncertainty that night encouraged. It did not. They examined rooms methodically. Bedrooms long unused. A sewing room with fabric folded neatly, but yellowed by age. A small library containing books carefully arranged, but rarely disturbed. Each space offered quiet abandonment rather than neglect. Ravenwood House had been kept, not lived in. At the far end of the corridor stood the door Henry Sallow had described. It was unremarkable in appearance, its surface smooth, and its handle plain. Yet Eleanor felt an unmistakable resistance when she reached it. A subtle reluctance that had nothing to do with hinges or locks. She removed the key from her pocket and held it up. Thomas inhaled sharply. The key fit. The door opened inward with surprising ease. The room beyond was narrow but tall, with a single high window that admitted pale light. Dust lay evenly across the floor, unbroken except for faint marks near the center. A bed frame stood against one wall, stripped of bedding. A wardrobe leaned slightly, its door ajar. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare. Margaret stepped inside first. She knelt near the floor and studied the marks. They were not recent enough to be clear, but they were not ancient either. Something heavy had been moved here, dragged rather than lifted. She rose and touched the wall beside the bed. The plaster bore faint scratches, as though someone had pressed fingers against it repeatedly. Thomas examined the desk. He found a shallow drawer that resisted opening, then yielded with a soft scrape. Inside lay a single folded paper. It was brittle, its ink faded but legible. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. It contained only a name and a date, written in a firm hand. The date corresponded to the year the eldest son had vanished. No explanation accompanied it. They stood in silence, absorbing the weight of the discovery. The room did not feel abandoned in the way others had. It felt concluded, as though something that had happened here was finished but not resolved. Eleanor closed the door gently. She felt no triumph, only a growing certainty that the house had begun revealing itself, not because they demanded answers, but because time had decided enough, had been withheld. Later that morning, as they descended the stairs, Mrs. Nettleby approached Eleanor quietly. She asked if the upper rooms had been satisfactory. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the corridor they had just left. Eleanor answered politely. She did not mention the note or the marks on the wall. It was shortly before noon when the unthinkable occurred. Thomas had stepped outside to inspect the rear of the house, accompanied by Mrs. Nettleby. Eleanor and Margaret remained inside, sorting through old ledgers in the study. The air was still. The house seemed almost subdued. Then a sound broke the quiet. A sharp noise, not loud but sudden, echoed from somewhere deep within the structure. It was followed by a dull thud, heavy enough to vibrate through the floorboards. Eleanor rose immediately. Margaret was already moving. They followed the sound through corridors and down a narrow staircase rarely used. The air grew cooler as they descended. The smell changed, carrying damp and something metallic. They reached the cellar door. It stood open. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. The cellar was dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered faintly. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars and tools. At the center of the space lay a shape that did not belong. Thomas Hale lay on the stone floor, unmoving. Eleanor rushed to him, kneeling at his side. His eyes were closed, his face pale. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He was breathing, shallowly. Margaret stood back, her gaze sweeping the room. She noticed immediately what Eleanor did not. A crate lay overturned near the far wall. One shelf leaned at an unnatural angle. The cellar had been disturbed with force, not accident. Eleanor called for Mrs. Nettleby, her voice sharper than she intended. Mrs. Nettleby appeared moments later, her face draining of color at the sight. She knelt beside Thomas and murmured that he must have fallen. Eleanor did not respond. Margaret's eyes rested on the shelf. A fall, she knew, did not leave marks like those. They carried Thomas upstairs and laid him on a sofa in the sitting room. Mrs. Nettleby fetched water and a cloth. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands shaking slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. Thomas stirred and groaned softly, but did not regain consciousness. Margaret stood near the door, listening. She heard something Eleanor did not. A sound, faint and distant, coming from within the walls themselves. Not movement exactly, more like the settling of something that had been active and was now still. The first unthinkable event had occurred, and it was not the injury alone that unsettled them. It was the certainty that Thomas had not been alone in the cellar. Thomas regained consciousness slowly, confusion clouding his expression before memory returned. He remembered descending into the cellar to inspect a report of dampness. He remembered reaching for a shelf. He remembered nothing after that. When Eleanor asked whether he had seen anyone, he shook his head. He could not say whether he had slipped or been pushed. The absence of certainty troubled him more than pain. Margaret remained quiet throughout the questioning. She asked only one thing. Had Thomas heard anyone before he fell? Thomas hesitated, then said he thought he had heard movement behind him. He had assumed it was Mrs. Nettleby. He had not turned around. The house absorbed this information without reaction. Afternoon passed in uneasy stillness. Eleanor insisted that Thomas rest. She considered sending for medical help, but hesitated. The nearest town was hours away, the road unreliable in weather like this. Thomas himself dismissed the idea, claiming he would recover with time. As evening approached, Eleanor faced a decision she could no longer delay. The incident in the cellar could not be ignored. It demanded acknowledgement. She gathered everyone in the sitting room, including Mrs. Nettleby. The atmosphere was calm on the surface, but tension sat beneath every word. Eleanor spoke plainly. She said someone had been in the house without their knowledge. The key, the hidden passage, the cellar incident. None of these could be explained by coincidence. She asked Mrs. Nettleby directly whether anyone else had access to Ravenwood House. Mrs. Nettleby listened carefully. When Eleanor finished, she folded her hands and replied that the house had always been difficult to secure fully. Old buildings, she said, had ways of being entered without force. Her answer was reasonable. It was also insufficient. Margaret asked whether anyone had been given permission to enter in recent days. Mrs. Nettleby paused before answering. She said no. The pause spoke more loudly than her words. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He reminded Eleanor that accusations without proof would only worsen matters. Eleanor agreed. She was not accusing. She was acknowledging reality. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake, listening. The house seemed unusually quiet, as though holding itself in check. Around midnight, she heard the sound again. Footsteps. This time they did not wander. They moved with purpose, traveling from one end of the house to the other. Eleanor rose and opened her door. The corridor lay empty. The footsteps continued, muffled but clear, moving toward the staircase. Eleanor followed at a distance, careful not to make noise. At the top of the stairs, she stopped. The sound descended. Someone was going down. Eleanor did not pursue. She stood listening as the footsteps reached the lower floor, then ceased abruptly. Silence returned, heavier than before. In the morning they found the cellar door locked. From the outside, the key Eleanor had discovered fit the lock perfectly. Inside the cellar, nothing appeared altered. The overturned crate had been righted. The shelf stood straight. It was as though the disturbance had been erased deliberately. Margaret examined the floor. She found faint drag marks leading toward the far wall. Then stopping, she placed her hand against the stone and felt a subtle difference in temperature. The wall was warmer there, just slightly. She said nothing aloud, but her mind settled on a single conclusion. The house was not only hiding its past, it was accommodating the present. The first unthinkable event had not been Thomas's fall. It had been the realization that Ravenwood House was being actively used by someone who knew it intimately, someone who moved within it, as though it were an extension of themselves. And whoever that person was, they were not finished. Chapter 4. Secrets Embedded in Walls. The discovery of the locked cellar changed the way Ravenwood House was perceived. Before, the house had been unsettling in a passive way. Its silence is suggestive, but ambiguous. Now it felt active, as though it had crossed an invisible boundary. Eleanor moved through its rooms with a new awareness, one sharpened by the certainty that someone else understood the house far better than she did. Morning brought no comfort. The grey light returned, thin and colourless, slipping through windows that seemed to dilute it further. Thomas remained bruised but mobile, his movements careful, his confidence diminished. Mrs. Nettleby performed her duties with consistent precision. Yet her presence now carried an undercurrent of restraint, as though she were guarding something unsaid. Margaret observed all of this quietly, storing impressions without comment. Eleanor proposed a thorough examination of the house's structure, rather than its contents. If Ravenwood House concealed passages and rooms not readily visible, then understanding its layout was no longer a matter of curiosity, but necessity. Thomas agreed, albeit reluctantly. He disliked the idea of wandering corridors and walls that now felt less metaphorical in their secrecy. They began in the oldest section of the house, identifiable by stonework darker than the rest, and door frames worn down to soft curves. Margaret ran her hand along the walls as they walked, noting changes in temperature and texture. She paused often, listening not for sounds but for absence, the places where echoes seemed to die too quickly. Behind the main staircase, partially hidden by a decorative panel, they found a narrow door Eleanor had not seen before. It led into a space no wider than a cupboard, but deeper than expected. Inside, the air was stale. The walls bore scratches at shoulder height, irregular and repetitive, as if someone had passed through in haste many times. Thomas examined the woodwork closely. He noted that the door's hinges were newer than the surrounding frame. Someone had altered it within recent decades, perhaps less. This was not a relic of ancient architecture, but a deliberate modification. Margaret noticed something else. The floor inside the narrow space was cleaner than the surrounding hallway, as though swept or walked upon more frequently. She said nothing yet, but her certainty deepened. This was not forgotten space. It was used. They continued their exploration with renewed focus. Beneath the tapestry in the west wing, Eleanor discovered a seam in the wall. Pressing against it caused a section of paneling to shift slightly. It opened onto a passage no one spoke of aloud. The corridor beyond sloped downward gently, its stone floor worn uneven by use. The smell was unmistakable. Old air disturbed recently. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. Thomas followed, his expression tense. Margaret brought up the rear, attentive to every detail. The passage twisted subtly, changing direction just enough to disorient those unfamiliar with it. At intervals, small alcoves appeared, each containing nothing but dust and the impression of previous occupation. At the end of the passage, they found themselves behind the cellar wall. The realization was quiet, but profound. The warm stone Margaret had noticed before now made sense. Someone had not merely entered the cellar. They had entered it unseen, from within the house itself. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The implications were clear. Whoever moved through Ravenwood House could do so without detection, emerging where they pleased. and retreating just as easily, they returned to the main rooms without speaking. Eleanor closed the hidden panel carefully. She felt no relief in understanding the mechanism. Knowledge, in this case, sharpened danger rather than dispelled it. Later that afternoon, Eleanor searched through the estate records stored in the study. Dusty ledgers documented repairs, expenses, and renovations. Margaret stood nearby, scanning spines and margins. It was Margaret who noticed an entry from decades earlier. A payment to a local builder for internal restructuring, vaguely described as reinforcement and safety improvements. No details followed. Thomas frowned when Eleanor read the entry aloud. He said such phrasing was unusual, especially for extensive work. Margaret suggested it might have been intentional. Secrecy disguised as safety. They cross-referenced dates. The renovations had occurred shortly before the eldest son's disappearance. That evening, Eleanor confronted Mrs. Nettleby gently. She asked whether the house had always contained such passages. Mrs. Nettleby paused longer than politeness required. She said the house had been altered many times. Families changed houses to suit their needs. Her voice was calm, but her hands tightened around the tray she carried. Margaret asked whether Mrs. Nettleby had ever used the passages herself. Mrs. Nettleby replied that she had no reason to. The answer was firm. Too firm. As night fell, the house seemed restless again. Eleanor felt it in the way shadows shifted subtly, even without movement. In the way air flowed through rooms, unevenly. She understood now that Ravenwood House did not simply hold secrets. It was built to contain them. And someone still knew how to use those spaces. The second discovery of the day came not through exploration, but through sound. It was late evening when Margaret heard it first. She was seated alone in the small library, reading without absorbing words, her attention divided between the page and the house. A soft tapping reached her ears, irregular and distant. It did not come from above or below. It came from within the walls. Margaret set the book aside and stood. She placed her palm against the wall, behind the shelf. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, then stopped. The silence that followed felt shaped, as though something were listening in return. She did not call out. Instead, she went to find Eleanor. Together they followed the wall's length, moving carefully. The sound resumed briefly near the junction of two corridors, then faded again. Eleanor felt a quiet certainty take hold. The house was being navigated from within, not randomly, but with intent. They found Thomas in the sitting room, poring over notes. When Eleanor explained, he dismissed the idea of someone inside the walls as improbable. But his voice lacked conviction. He had felt the house too keenly to deny its capabilities entirely. They decided to test the passages. Margaret suggested a simple method. One of them would remain in the cellar, while another moved through the hidden corridors. Sound, she reasoned, would travel differently through stone than through open space. Patterns would emerge. Thomas volunteered to remain above ground, unwilling to return to the cellar after his fall. Eleanor agreed to descend. Margaret would move through the passageways. The plan was carried out with quiet efficiency. Eleanor stood in the cellar, lantern in hand, listening. Above her, somewhere unseen, Margaret began walking. The sounds came faintly, but clearly. Footsteps shifted direction without echo. Eleanor could trace Margaret's path not by volume but by rhythm. Then Margaret stopped. Eleanor waited. The silence stretched. Then a sound reached her that did not match Margaret's steps. Another set of footsteps joined the passage. Eleanor's breath caught. She listened closely. The new steps were slower, heavier. They moved in parallel to Margaret's position, then paused. Eleanor called Margaret's name softly. No answer. Panic threatened, but did not take hold. Eleanor forced herself to remain still, to listen. After several seconds, Margaret's footsteps resumed, brisk now, moving away from the other presence. The heavier steps followed briefly, then retreated. Moments later, Margaret emerged into the cellar, her face composed, but pale. She shook her head slightly, signaling Eleanor not to speak yet. They returned upstairs and closed the door. Margaret spoke only when they were certain no one stood nearby. She said she had heard breathing within the passage, close enough to feel warmth. She said it had stopped when she stopped. Whatever moved through Ravenwood House was aware of them. Thomas listened in silence. The matter was no longer theoretical. That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking of walls built not to separate rooms, but to conceal movement. Ravenwood House was no longer merely an inherited burden. It was a structure designed for concealment, altered to allow someone to exist unseen within it. The secrets were not only embedded in its walls, they were sustained by them. And whoever relied on those secrets was growing bolder. The house had given them knowledge, but knowledge carried its own danger. They were no longer simply guests uncovering history. They were participants in a quiet struggle for control over a space that had never belonged entirely to anyone who walked openly through its halls. Chapter 5. Motives beneath manners. By the 5th day at Ravenwood House, politeness had become a fragile performance. The surface of daily routine remained intact, but beneath it ran a current of unease that could no longer be ignored. Meals were still shared. Conversations still began with neutral topics. Yet every exchange carried weight now, as though each word might be examined later, for meaning it had not seemed to hold at the time. Eleanor sensed this most keenly in herself. She had begun to watch rather than listen, to notice not what was said but what was avoided. Ravenwood House had taught her that silence was rarely empty. It was shaped by intention. Thomas Hale moved carefully through the house, his confidence replaced by measured restraint. He continued his work, reviewing documents and correspondence, but his attention drifted often. He flinched at sudden sounds. He avoided the cellar entirely. His bruises were fading, yet the uncertainty of how they had been caused lingered visibly in his posture. Mrs. Nettleby remained constant in her duties, and it was this constancy that drew attention. She rose early, retired late, and seemed always to know where things were meant to be. Her familiarity with the house was complete, yet she never volunteered information, unless asked directly. Even then, her answers were precise and limited, as though shaped by long habit. Margaret Finch observed all of this with quiet patience. She did not hurry toward conclusions. Instead, she allowed impressions to accumulate, trusting that patterns would reveal themselves. She noticed how Mrs. Nettleby avoided certain corridors, how Thomas's gaze lingered on doors now rather than papers, how Eleanor's movements through the house had grown deliberate, almost investigative. The house itself seemed calmer. There were fewer unexplained sounds, fewer disturbances. The silence felt strategic rather than peaceful. Someone, Margaret suspected, was listening. That afternoon, Eleanor invited Mrs. Nettleby to sit with her in the small drawing room. The request was polite, framed as a conversation rather than an inquiry. Tea was poured. The ritual was familiar, designed to soften boundaries. Eleanor asked about the years following the disappearance of the eldest son. Mrs. Nettleby replied that she had not been present then. She had arrived later, during a period when the family sought order and discretion. Eleanor asked what that discretion had involved. Mrs. Nettleby answered that it meant keeping the house running smoothly, regardless of circumstances. Margaret, seated slightly apart, asked whether any visitors had stayed secretly during that time. Mrs. Nettleby's hand paused briefly above her teacup before settling it down. She said she had never been instructed to acknowledge unregistered guests. The phrasing was careful. Margaret noted it. Later, Thomas spoke privately with Eleanor. He admitted that Victor Langford had contacted him again by letter, expressing concern about Eleanor's extended stay. The tone was courteous but persistent. He offered assistance in managing the estate, even suggesting temporary oversight should Eleanor find the situation overwhelming. Eleanor found the suggestion intrusive. Margaret found it revealing. Concern, she said, often disguised fear of exposure. That evening, Eleanor wandered alone through the east wing. She found herself standing before a door she had previously ignored, a modest one leading to a narrow bedroom. Inside, the room was sparse. A bed, a small table, a chair positioned close to the window. What caught Eleanor's attention was the arrangement. The chair was placed at an angle that allowed a view of the courtyard below, where the service entrance lay hidden from the main drive. Someone had watched from here. Eleanor sat in the chair briefly, testing the line of sight. From this position, movements below were clearly visible. She felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Ravenwood House had not only been navigated through hidden passages, it had been observed, monitored, understood. When Eleanor shared this with Margaret nodded slowly. She said that secrets were rarely kept by accident. They required effort, planning, and motive. The question was no longer whether someone was using the house. It was why. The answer began to take shape through contradiction rather than revelation. Margaret spent the next day speaking casually with Mrs. Nettleby while assisting with small tasks. She asked about suppliers, about the gardener who came in summer, about old repairs. Mrs. Nettleby answered willingly when the topics were practical. When Margaret asked about the family's personal history, the answers became shorter. Margaret did not press. She waited. In the afternoon, Victor Langford arrived again, unannounced. This time he brought documents, historical records he claimed might interest Eleanor. His manner was polite, his voice calm, yet he seemed unsettled by the changes in the house. He noticed a door left ajar that had previously been closed. He asked whether Eleanor had found everything she expected. Eleanor replied that she had found more than she expected. Victor smiled, but his eyes tightened. He spoke of the importance of preserving Ravenwood House's legacy. He mentioned the village's reliance on stable ownership. He suggested that certain truths were best left undisturbed for the sake of harmony. Margaret watched him closely. She noticed how his gaze avoided the staircase leading to the older wing. She noticed how his fingers tapped once against his coat when Eleanor mentioned hidden passages. After Victor left, Margaret spoke quietly. She said Victor was afraid of something specific, not abstract. His concern was not about history being forgotten, but about it being remembered accurately. That night, Eleanor reviewed the ledger entries again. One payment stood out now more clearly than before. It was made not by the family patriarch, but by a trustee. The name matched one Margaret had seen earlier in village records. It matched Victor Langford's grandfather. The realization arrived without drama. Motive settled into place not as an accusation, but as an explanation. The eldest son's disappearance, the renovations, the secrecy. Someone outside the family had been involved. Someone with influence enough to ensure silence. Someone whose descendants still benefited from that silence. Margaret shared this insight with Thomas cautiously. He resisted at first, unwilling to see a respected local figure implicated, but logic pressed forward steadily. The alterations to the house had required permission. The disappearance had required cooperation. Silence had required reinforcement over generations. Later that night, Margaret heard movement again within the walls. She did not pursue it. Instead, she waited near the study, where she suspected the passage would emerge. She listened to the rhythm of footsteps. They paused, hesitated, then moved away. In the morning, Eleanor found a document missing from the study. It was not one of legal importance, but a personal letter she had discovered earlier, written by the eldest son. It hinted at conflict, at disagreement with someone outside the family. It named no one. But its absence was telling. Someone had searched her papers. Eleanor no longer felt fear. She felt resolve. The politeness that had governed her behavior now seemed inadequate. Ravenwood House had been used as a shield for too long. Manners had hidden motives. Silence had protected wrongdoing. Margaret agreed. She said the truth was close now, not because they had forced it, but because the one who hid it was becoming impatient. Movement increased when secrets felt threatened. The house grew restless again that evening. Doors whispered. Walls seemed to carry sound. Ravenwood House was no longer neutral ground. It had become a contested space, and beneath the calm surface of courtesy, the struggle between concealment and exposure had begun to tilt, slowly but unmistakably, toward the light. Chapter 6. The House Gives Up Its Secret. The calm that settled over Ravenwood House on the 6th morning was not reassuring. It was the stillness that follows a long-held breath, the kind that precedes a deliberate act. Eleanor sensed it the moment she woke. The house felt alert, attentive in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Even the light entering her room seemed carefully measured, pale and indirect, as though filtered by intention. She dressed quietly and moved through the corridor with deliberate care. The boards did not creak beneath her steps, an absence that unsettled her more than noise would have. When she reached the staircase, she paused and listened. Nothing. The house was holding itself steady. In the breakfast room, Thomas sat already awake, his posture rigid, a cup of untouched tea before him. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and for a moment neither spoke. The shared understanding between them required no explanation. Something was about to change. Margaret joined them soon after. She appeared composed, but her eyes carried focus, sharpened by anticipation. Mrs. Nettleby arrived last, her movements precise, her expression unreadable. She served breakfast without comment, then lingered near the doorway longer than necessary. Eleanor spoke gently, but directly. She said they needed to speak about the house, about its design, about its history. She said they were past the point of quiet observation. Mrs. Nettleby did not protest. Instead, she set the tray down carefully and took a seat uninvited. The action itself was a small surrender. Eleanor noticed the way her hands rested on her lap, fingers interlaced tightly. Margaret spoke next. She described the passages, the warmth in the walls, the footsteps that did not belong to anyone openly present. She did not accuse. She simply stated facts as she had observed them. Mrs. Nettleby listened without interruption. When Margaret finished, she nodded slowly. She said the house had always been more than it appeared. She said it had been shaped by fear long before Eleanor inherited it. She spoke then of the eldest son, of a disagreement that had grown dangerous. He had learned something he was not meant to know, something involving the family trustee and a transaction that had transferred land and wealth quietly, improperly. When the son threatened to expose it, the house became a solution. The renovations had been ordered quickly. Passages were added. Rooms altered. The son had been confined, not for days but for weeks, hidden within the house itself. Mrs. Nettleby said she had not been present then, but she had been told enough to understand. When the son disappeared officially, the truth had already been sealed behind stone. Thomas sat very still as she spoke. The legal implications unfolded in his mind, even as the moral ones settled. Eleanor felt the weight of the house press inward, not oppressively but conclusively. Ravenwood House had not merely concealed a crime. It had been engineered to contain it. Margaret asked the question Eleanor could not yet voice. Was anyone still using the passages? Mrs. Nettleby hesitated, then answered honestly. Yes, she said the knowledge of the passages had been passed down quietly, guarded by those who benefited from the original silence. Victor Langford's family had ensured the house remained in cooperative hands. Someone still came at night, she said. Someone who believed the house belonged as much to them as to its owner. Eleanor felt no shock, only clarity. They decided then to confront the truth directly, not through accusation, but through inevitability. If the house gave access, it could also give evidence. That afternoon, they prepared carefully. Margaret mapped the passages as fully as she could. Thomas reviewed records again, noting inconsistencies now made meaningful. Eleanor gathered letters and documents that had survived. As evening fell, Ravenwood House seemed to sense the shift. Air moved through corridors more freely. Sounds returned, measured and intentional. Someone was aware of being observed. The house was no longer hiding its secret. Night descended with quiet resolve. Eleanor extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only a few lit deliberately. The house became a landscape of shadow and intention. They waited. Margaret positioned herself near the study, where the passage opened behind the shelves. Thomas remained in the sitting room, ostensibly reading. Eleanor sat near the staircase, where sound travelled most clearly. Mrs. Nettleby retired to her quarters, her role complete. The first movement came just after midnight. A soft click. A shift of air. Footsteps travelling within stone. Margaret felt the vibration through the wall before she heard it. She placed her hand against the panel and counted silently. The rhythm was familiar now. Unhurried. Confident. She waited until the footsteps reached the junction of passages, then pressed the panel inward. It opened. The man inside froze. He was older than Eleanor had expected, his hair greying at the temples, his coat worn but well kept. Victor Langford stood revealed not as an intruder, but as someone interrupted mid-routine. His expression shifted quickly, calculation replacing surprise. Eleanor stepped forward from the shadows. She spoke his name calmly. Victor did not deny his presence. He looked around the house as though reassessing it, then said quietly that it had always been part of his family's responsibility. He said some truths were too disruptive to be released. He said Ravenwood House had been used to preserve order. Margaret replied gently that order built on confinement was not order at all. Victor's composure fractured slightly. He said the son had been unstable. Dangerous. He said the house had kept the village safe. He spoke as though repeating justification long rehearsed. Thomas emerged then, holding documents. He spoke of records altered, of land transfers disguised as inheritance. He spoke of responsibility deferred across generations. Victor listened. His shoulders sagged. The house, stripped of secrecy, no longer supported his certainty. Eleanor spoke last. She said the house would no longer serve as a hiding place, that its design would be exposed, that its history would be corrected. She did not threaten. She simply stated what would happen. Victor did not resist. He stepped out of the passage and into the open space of the room. The walls seemed to recede slightly, as though relieved of their burden. By morning, the house felt different. Not lighter, but resolved. The secrets embedded in its walls had been acknowledged. They no longer required concealment. Ravenwood House had given up its secret, not through force, but through patience. It had waited for the moment, when silence became heavier than truth. And now, in the quiet that followed revelation, the house stood unchanged in stone, but altered in purpose. No longer a keeper of shadows, but a witness to what had finally been seen. Chapter 7. What Remains After Silence. Morning returned to Ravenwood House, with a clarity it had not known before. The light was still pale, the sky still overcast, yet something within the rooms had shifted. Eleanor felt it as she moved through the corridor. The air no longer pressed inward. It rested, as though relieved of a duty it had carried too long. Victor Langford remained seated in the sitting room, composed but diminished. He did not attempt departure. He did not ask for privacy. His posture suggested acceptance rather than defeat. The struggle that had sustained secrecy across generations had ended not with confrontation, but with exposure. Thomas contacted the appropriate authorities quietly and without urgency. There was no need for haste now. Facts no longer needed protection. When he finished, he returned to the room and sat across from Victor, the documents laid out between them. They did not speak immediately. Silence had become neutral ground. Mrs. Nettleby moved through the house as she always had, but Eleanor noticed a subtle difference. Her shoulders were less rigid. Her gaze no longer avoided corridors. She performed her tasks with a steadiness that suggested release rather than obligation. When Eleanor thanked her for her honesty, Mrs. Nettleby inclined her head and said only that the house had waited long enough. Margaret walked alone through the passages one final time. She did not seek further discovery. She traced routes she now understood fully, touching walls where secrets had once pressed outward. The warmth she had felt before was gone. The stone was cool and ordinary. The house no longer responded, because it no longer needed to. By midday, representatives arrived. Their presence was efficient and respectful. There were questions, statements, confirmations. Victor spoke without resistance. His explanations were measured, stripped of justification. The truth, once spoken aloud, no longer required defense. Eleanor stood near the window and watched the moor as proceedings unfolded. She felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that something had been set back into alignment. Ravenwood House had not demanded justice. It had demanded acknowledgement. As the authorities departed with Victor, the house remained still. No doors whispered. No footsteps echoed where they should not. The silence felt complete, rather than expectant. Eleanor gathered with Thomas and Margaret in the sitting room. They spoke briefly of practical matters, ownership, restoration, the future. Yet beneath the words lay an understanding that went beyond property or responsibility. The house had changed their relationship to it. They were no longer visitors uncovering history. They were witnesses to its conclusion. That evening, Eleanor walked the grounds alone. The moor stretched outward, unchanged by what had occurred within stone walls. She paused and looked back at Ravenwood House. It stood as it always had. Solid, reserved, but no longer watchful. She realized then that the house had never been alive in the way fear suggested. It had been burdened. And burdens, once lifted, leave behind a different kind of quiet. The final night at Ravenwood House passed without incident. Eleanor slept deeply for the first time since her arrival. There were no footsteps, no sounds within walls. The house settled into itself naturally, like a structure finally allowed to rest. Morning brought practical closure. Thomas prepared to leave, his work nearly complete. He thanked Eleanor with professional formality, but his voice carried genuine respect. He said the estate's history would require careful handling. Eleanor agreed. Accuracy mattered now more than discretion ever had. Margaret lingered longer than the others. She stood in the entrance hall, studying the portraits one last time. Their painted eyes no longer seemed watchful. They appeared simply human, shaped by time and context, rather than concealment. Margaret told Eleanor that houses reflected those who used them. Ravenwood House had been shaped by fear and control, but it would now reflect something else. Eleanor listened, understanding that the house's future would depend on how it was lived in, rather than how it was guarded. Mrs. Nettleby approached Eleanor before departure. She asked whether Eleanor intended to remain. Eleanor said she did. At least for a while. Mrs. Nettleby nodded, relief visible for the first time. She said the house would respond well to honesty. When Eleanor was alone again, she walked through each room deliberately. She opened doors once hidden. She let light into corners, long denied it. She did not attempt to erase the house's past. She allowed it to settle into its proper place. Ravenwood House would never be ordinary. It would always carry memory. But memory no longer needed secrecy to survive. As Eleanor closed the front door that evening, she paused and rested her hand against the stone. It was cool, unremarkable, solid. The silence that followed her step into the open air was complete, not empty. Complete, and in that completeness, Ravenwood House finally became what it had never been allowed to be before. A house at rest. Ravenwood House did not change its shape when the truth was spoken. Its walls did not crumble. Its corridors did not realign. Stone remained stone. Wood remained wood. Yet something essential had shifted all the same. What had once been held tight within its structure was finally allowed to leave. Eleanor remained, not out of duty, but out of choice. She learned the house slowly, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a place to be lived in honestly. Windows were opened regularly. Doors stayed unlocked by day. Light was invited rather than restrained. The house responded in the only way a place can. It grew quieter. Margaret departed without ceremony, carrying with her the understanding that some mysteries do not end in revelation alone, but in restoration. Thomas returned to his work, knowing that justice sometimes arrives without spectacle, carried instead by persistence and attention. Ravenwood House stood, as it always had, overlooking the moor, unchanged to those who passed it, without knowing. But it no longer concealed movement within its walls. It no longer required silence to survive. What remained was not the echo of wrongdoing, but the absence of it. And in that absence, the house finally became what it had never truly been before. A place that no longer needed to remember by hiding, only by standing,